Hello, I'm Steve Evans from Acts Community Church in Tylestown in the Rhondda. The last time we were together, we looked at Jesus meeting Peter and calling Peter to follow him. Peter responded, and him and his brother Andrew and their friends James and John had started following Jesus as one of his disciples. And Peter was discovering more and more who this Jesus was, how he was no mere man, and Jesus was showing Peter and his other friends how to live this life. Today we pick Peter's story up at a moment when Peter responds to a challenge to go deeper with Jesus. A challenge to put his faith in action. My friend Rob Jones says faith is belief with boots on. You see, belief is okay, but it's not enough to just believe. Often we need to put our faith into action, go into action. And Peter was challenged to put his faith boots on in this story. And I believe that Jesus is challenging many of us to do the same. The time for faith-filled action is now, not at some perfect day in the future. It's an illusion. That perfect day will never come. You see, COVID-19 has shaken, challenged many of us. It's caused us to think again about life, about priorities, and about, is there more to life than this? Now is a good time, perhaps, to listen and to see if Jesus is challenging you, is challenging us. Let's pick up our story. Peter spent his entire life living on the shore of the Sea of Galilee and had logged thousands of hours fishing and sailing across the sea. But on this occasion, Peter would have an experience unlike anything he'd ever had before. In the Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 14, the story is recounted. Here it is. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Ooh, bit of a story, eh? Why were the disciples so terrified when they saw Jesus walking on the water? They were in a storm, and then they saw someone. They assumed initially it was a spirit, a ghost. Several writers have suggested that there was a tradition that at the bottom of the Sea of the Galilee was a portal to the underworld, to the realm of the dead. The disciples were already scared, but now they were terrified. As it appeared, a spirit had escaped from the underworld. Maybe they thought that spirit was going to take them down to that realm of the dead. And just at that moment, when their fears were at their highest point, Jesus said this. I love these words. "Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid." It's important to note that the gospel writers want you to know that Jesus came to his friends at the hour of their need. He was watching over them before that, but they couldn't see him. And this was intended to be a picture about how Jesus draws close to us in our storms, in our darkness. We're meant to recognize in these stories what happens in our life. We will all experience storms in our lives. They can terrify us if we allow us to face them alone. When we're walking through the storms that we'll inevitably face, we should remember these stories of Jesus coming and drawing close to his friends. We can remember his words, be encouraged. It is me. Don't be afraid. Those three little words, don't be afraid, are the most frequently spoken words from God to human beings in Scripture. You find the phrase more than 140 times in the Bible. During the storms in our lives, when the waves are crashing up against our boat and we fear we won't survive, Jesus still walks on the water and comes to wherever we are at. He gets in the boat with us. Now, Jesus may not necessarily take the storm away, but he'll come and join you in the boat, in the storm. The sickness may still be there. The financial mess may still be a mess. The depression may still be real. But Jesus is in it with you, with me. And somehow that makes the storm far less terrifying. It is a part of what a Christian spiritual life is all about. Knowing Jesus' presence with us enables us to have a peace. It's a peace that the world can't understand. It's a peace even when the storm is raging all around us. I think this is what the gospel writers wanted us to know from the first part of this story. That he is God, he is real, and he wants to draw close to us in those storms of life and ride out the storm with us. Often, it's in a storm that people actually meet God. They actually find him in the crisis. If you're in a storm right now, God wants to draw close to you right in it. Keep an eye out for him. As we return to Matthew's telling of the story, we find the disciples uncertain if they can believe their eyes. Could that really be Jesus walking on the water in the middle of the storm? Only Peter was bold enough to speak up, and even he seemed a little bit unsure. He said, Lord, if it is you, ask me to come to you on the water. Have you ever thought about what an odd thing this was for Peter to say? You know, imagine Peter in the middle of this storm. Jesus is out there in the water. Peter's in the boat. I would have said, Jesus, come here quick. Perhaps throwing him a light jacket. Perhaps reached out a hand to bring him in. Peter does the opposite and says, can I come out to you? He has the audacity to ask Jesus, can I step out of the boat and come to you? You see, Christianity is often counterintuitive. It's often opposite to the world's view. For example, think of things like, think of others before yourself. The last will be first. The weak will be strong. The foolish will be chosen rather than the wise. Fool. Peter, very important detail here, Peter just doesn't get out of the boat, doesn't just jump headlong out of the boat. Peter waited for Jesus to call him out of the boat. He wanted to know if Jesus thought it was a good idea for him to get out of the boat. He waited for the call. He did not trust in his own ability to walk on water. You see, walking on water is a picture of us human beings doing things that we could never do on our own. We couldn't do in our own strength, but with God, we can do them. There's always a call. There's always some fear. There's reassurance. Then there's a decision. Do you do it or don't you? And then there's a change in your life. The story is not about taking risk. It's about obedience. The story is not about extreme sports. It's about obedience. Responding in faith to Jesus. Jesus said to Peter, come. And Peter stepped out of the boat. I was preparing this talk up in my attic study on Tuesday, the 25th of August, 2020. And my Velux roof windows were shaking in the middle of Storm Francis as it hit the Rhondda with some big winds and rain. Yet I was still in the warmth and security of my house. Imagine Peter on the dark Sea of Galilee. Imagine the size of the waves, the strength of the wind. What would you choose? The water or the boat? Safety and familiarity or faith and adventure? If you get out of the boat, there's a good chance you might sink. you might fail. But if you don't get out the boat, it is a guaranteed certainty that you will never ever walk on water with Jesus. If you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. Wow, here is the challenge. Come. Peter had been following Jesus for some time, but now he is challenged to step out of the boat onto the Sea of the Galilee in the middle of a terrifying storm. Whew. Can you imagine it? Peter had been working on the water all his adult life. His experience had taught him that getting out of the boat in the middle of the lake meant that either a person would have to sink or swim. Walking was not an established option. And in a storm like that, being far from the shore, swimming wasn't much of an option either. Today, Jesus is still saying, come. A few years back, a man called John Ortberg wrote a terrific book called If You Want to Walk on Water, You Got to Get Out of the Boat. And the book is built around this one passage. For Ortberg, the fishing boat is a metaphor that represents safety, security, the status quo, our comfort zone. Along with discussing Peter's bold step of faith, Ortberg turns the reader's attention back to the other 11 disciples still in the boat. We often knock Peter because, as we see in a moment, he takes his eyes off Jesus and begins to sink. But notice the other 11 who didn't even think about getting out of the boat, as far as we know. And Ortberg refers to them as boat potatoes, or perhaps in modern day church speak, it would be poo potatoes. They stayed there where they were. They remained in the boat because they were afraid of what could happen if they. Are you afraid of what could happen if you? You see, fear is everywhere. We struggle with fear so much of the time without even realizing it. There's a biochemical reason for this. Part of our brain is always watching out for danger, pondering at a subconscious level what the possible dangers and threats are. Our survival can depend on a healthy level of fear. But fear also has an amazing capacity to grip us, to hold us back, stop us doing the things we meant to do and becoming the people we meant to become. Let's go back to the story. After Peter stepped out of the boat, he actually walked on water. First time in history, an ordinary human is water walking. Peter must have been so thrilled for a while to be out there on the water with his Jesus, walking together on the water. But then it happened. Peter saw the wind. Peter noticed the strong wind. It frightened him. When he became frightened, he began to sink and he cried out, Lord, rescue me. And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and lifted Peter up. We all know what it is like in life to see the wind. Because of the wind, we often choose not to leave the comfort and the security of our boats. Some of us begin a new adventure full of faith, full of excitement, and then setbacks, opposition, obstacles arise. We see the wind. Yet Jesus keeps wanting us to grow, to develop, to become more like him. And if we want to grow in him, then there will be more and more challenges to go deeper. And each time we're called to go deeper, there will be an element of fear. The storms, the wind, the waves. Do not be afraid, Jesus whispers. Come join me on this great adventure. Come out on the water. Each time you respond and get out of your boat in faith, it gets more likely that you will respond the next time you're called or challenged. On the other hand, every time that we resist that voice and choose to stay in the boat, then the voice gets quieter and quieter in you. And sadly, at last, you don't hear its call at all. Peter began to sink and he cried out. And it's often the only prayer we can cry out in some of the situations we end up in life. Lord, save me. Lord, rescue me. Lord, help me. And he did. After rescuing him, Jesus said to him, you man of little faith, why did you begin to have doubts? The gospel doesn't really tell us about Jesus' tone of voice, but I don't think he was really cross with Peter. You see, Peter had shown a lot more faith than the other 11 who had stayed in the boat. I think Jesus was expressing disappointment. I can imagine Jesus saying to Peter something like, Peter, why did you look away? I had you. You didn't need to worry. If only you trusted me, we could have had great fun out there on the water. As it is so often with Peter, we see him taking 2 amazing steps forward and then 1 step back. And it's a picture we see again and again as we look more at his life in future times. Faithful and bold, yet easily confused, deterred, and also flawed. And maybe that's why we like him. Because he reminds us of ourselves. He reminds us that despite our flaws, we can still be followers of Jesus Christ. He will still rescue us, befriend us, and use us. In his book, Ortberg states that failure is not an event, but a judgment about an event. It is a way that we think about an outcome. A man called Jonas Salk developed a vaccine for polio that worked. But before he developed that vaccine, he had, on 200 occasions, tried to develop it unsuccessfully. Somebody asked him, how did it feel to fail 200 times? He replied, I never failed 200 times. I just discovered 200 ways how not to vaccinate for polio. Did Peter fail? Well, okay. Let's say he discovered what not to do when water walking. But there were 11 others in the boat who failed quietly, privately, without any criticism really. You see, the worst failure isn't to sink in the waves. It is never to get out of the boat. Because Peter put himself in a position to fail, he also put himself in a position to grow, to learn, to develop, to change, to become more like Jesus. Cracking story about Sir Edmund Hillary. He made several unsuccessful attempts to climb Mount Everest before he finally succeeded. After 1 attempt, he stood at the base of the mountain and shook his fist at the mountain. And he said, I will defeat you yet, because you are as big as you're ever going to get. But I'm still growing. Every time Hillary climbed Everest and failed, he learned something. And he grew. And he tried again. And he learned and he grew. And then one day, he didn't fail. He stood on the summit of Everest. Picking up the story, Matthew tells us when they got into the boat, the wind settled down, and then those in the boat worshipped Jesus, and they said, you must be God's son. The Greek word used to worship here involves giving honor and great respect. Literally, it means to lean forward or bow down before someone, to kiss them, usually on their hand or their feet, is a term describing the honor most often reserved for God. Yet there is something more going on here. This astounding miracle was revealing something profound about the man standing in the boat with them. In some sense, they had experienced in that moment an encounter with God. What kind of man walks on water? What kind of man calms the storms? Sailors and fishermen knew. Who is it that calms the winds and the waves, who delivers the sailors from harm? The Jewish fishermen would have known the answer to the question. It is God. It is the first time in the Gospels that we see the disciples declaring Jesus to be God's son. The first time they declared this kind of faith in him. They'd known him as a carpenter from Nazareth. They'd known him as a rabbi, a teacher, who had called them to be fishers of people. They'd seen him perform some miracles. The disciples didn't yet fully understand who he was, but they'd experienced God's presence that night on the sea. To finish then, in a recent survey of older people, a common theme that emerged was people wishing they had taken more risks in their lives. In the words of our message, that they'd gotten out of the boat more often. It's been said that everybody dies, but not everybody truly lives. Peter would have catched up to his grandchildren, and he would have told them about the night he did something only 2 people had ever done, I'm a water walker, kids. It was incredible. To walk on water with Jesus, you got to get out of your boat. Theodore Roosevelt put it a bit like this: it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither knew victory nor defeat. Like Peter, there is something within us that declares there is more to life than this. We're made for more than just avoiding failure. Something within us that is eternal, that longs for the things of God. Something that wants to walk on water, to leave the comfort of routine existence and abandon ourselves to an incredible adventure with a God following him. When that inner voice challenges you or me in faith, and you know it is Jesus saying, come on, let's do it. Let's get out of our boat. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good day.